the first time Edith Barrett laid eyes on James Ramsey. He shoved a drunk man out of his way on the boardwalk of Caldwell, Kansas, and did not once look back to see if the fellow had fallen. That was the summer of 1878, when Caldwell was still clawing its way out of the dust to become something resembling a proper town, and Edith had arrived only 3 days prior with her father's wagon, 2 trunks of dry goods, and a heart full of determined optimism. She was 24 years old, brown-haired and brown-eyed, not particularly tall and not particularly short, and she possessed the kind of quiet intelligence that men in that era either admired from a respectful distance or failed to notice entirely. Her father, Harold Barrett, had recently purchased the mercantile on Main Street after the previous owner had succumbed to a fever, and Edith had come along to help him run it, having spent the better part of her life bookkeeping and managing inventory back in Wichita. She was sweeping the front step of the mercantile when the incident occurred. The drunk man was named Cyrus Aldridge, and he was a harmless sort who spent his afternoons leaning against one wall or another in a pleasant fog. James Ramsey had come striding down the middle of the boardwalk like it was a road built specifically for his use, broad shoulders squared, dusty hat pulled low, not watching where he was going or rather not caring, and Cyrus had simply been in his path. One hard shove with a forearm and Cyrus stumbled into the railing, saved from falling only by luck and the solidity of the post. James Ramsey did not pause. He pushed through the door of the saloon across the street and disappeared into its dim interior. Edith watched all of this with her broom still in her hands. She looked at poor Cyrus, who had recovered himself and was blinking at the saloon door with confused dignity, and she felt a slow burn of irritation work its way up her chest. She asked old Walt Perkins, who ran the feed store next door and seemed to know everything about everybody, who the man was. Walt had leaned on his doorframe and squinted. James Ramsey, drifter, more or less. Comes through Caldwell 2-3 times a year driving cattle up from Texas. Good with a rope, better with a rifle. Rough sort. Does not exactly go out of his way to make himself agreeable. Walt had paused, scratching at his gray beard. But he pays his debts, which puts him ahead of about half this town. Edith had thanked Walt and gone back to her sweeping and decided, with the quiet certainty of a woman who trusted her own judgment, that James Ramsey was exactly what he appeared to be. A selfish, rough-edged man who moved through the world like it owed him clear passage and did not particularly concern himself with whoever he knocked aside in the process. She did not expect to think much more about him. Caldwell had other things to occupy her attention. There was the mercantile to set in order, which was no small task since the previous owner had kept his inventory with a system that appeared to have been devised by a man in the grip of a fever dream. There were accounts to reconcile, shelving to reorganize, suppliers to write to, and a steady stream of customers to learn. Her father, Harold, was a good-natured man in his 50s with a bad hip and a tendency to give too much credit to people who didn't deserve it, and Edith quietly compensated for both by being precise and firm in the ways he was not. She learned the rhythms of Caldwell quickly. She learned that Friday afternoons were busy because the cowboys coming off a trail drive would come in for supplies and candy and small comforts. She learned that Tuesday mornings were slow and good for inventory. She learned that the sheriff, a man named Beaumont, was decent but overworked, and that the town had enough rough edges to keep him perpetually occupied. She also learned over the next several weeks more about James Ramsey than she had asked for, because Walt Perkins enjoyed conversation and James Ramsey was a convenient subject. He was 30 years old, she was told. He had been born in Missouri and come west after the war, which had taken his father and 2 brothers and left him with a practical, unsentimental view of the world. He had worked as a cowhand since he was old enough to be useful, had driven cattle up the Kishom Trail more times than he could likely count, and had the lean, weathered look of a man who spent most of his life outdoors in conditions that were rarely pleasant. He had a small reputation for card playing that was more skill than luck, and a larger reputation for keeping his word once it was given, which people in Caldwell seemed to consider his chief saving grace. None of this softened Edith's impression of him particularly. She saw him twice more that first month, both times at a distance. Once he was coming out of the bank looking unhappy about whatever transaction he had just conducted, and once he was at the far end of Main Street talking to another cowboy in the animated, gestural way that men used when they were discussing horses. He was, she supposed, not unattractive in the way that rough, weather-beaten men sometimes weren't, but that was beside the point entirely. The point was that she had formed an opinion of him and saw no reason to revise it. Then September came, and with it the cattle drive south out of Caldwell, and James Ramsey left along with most of the cowboys who had been filling up the saloons and the boarding houses, and occasionally the mercantile. The town grew quieter, and Edith settled deeper into her routine, and the matter of James Ramsey receded to a small, unimportant corner of her mind. It was October when he came back, and she almost did not recognize him at first because he came in through the mercantile door instead of storming past it. She was behind the counter tallying a column of figures when the bell above the door chimed, and she looked up and found him standing there, hat in hand, which was its own small surprise, looking at the shelves with an expression that was not hostile, merely evaluating. "Morning," he said. His voice was lower than she had expected, a plain, flat baritone without much decoration to it. "Good morning," she said, with the professional pleasantness she extended to everyone. "Can I help you find something?" He looked at her directly then, and she got a proper look at his face for the first time at close range. Dark eyes, a jaw that needed a razor's attention, a scar along his chin that she guessed was old. He was not a handsome man in any polished sense, but there was a solidity to his face that was difficult to look away from, something functional and unadorned like a well-made tool. "Thread," he said, "and a good needle if you have one." She found both for him. He paid precisely what she asked, thanked her without ceremony, and left. Edith stood at the counter for a moment after the bell had finished its small music, and she thought, with mild irritation, that he had been entirely unremarkable in his behavior, and that this was somehow inconvenient, because it was harder to maintain a clear opinion of a man who bought thread and said thank you. She shook the thought off and went back to her tallying. He came back the following week for lamp oil, and the week after that for a tin of tobacco and a length of rope, and by the time November had settled its cold hands on Caldwell, James Ramsey was something like a regular customer, which was not the same thing as being a welcome one, Edith told herself, because she extended the same professional courtesy to everyone. What she noticed, without particularly wanting to, was that he never haggled and never complained about prices. He was not warm exactly, but he was also not rude. He answered questions with honest directness and did not volunteer more than was asked. Twice she saw him hold the door for the elderly Mrs. Calloway, who ran the hat shop and moved slowly with her cane, and once she watched from the window as he helped a rancher whose wagon wheel had come loose in the middle of the street, kneeling in the mud without complaint, and using his bare hands and a stone to knock the wheel back into place. She filed these observations away without letting them change her assessment. People could be decent in small moments and still be essentially selfish in character. She had known enough of the world to understand that. What finally cracked the hard shell of her certainty was not any further small observation. It was a single afternoon in late November, on the road to Dodge City, in the middle of land that offered very little mercy to anybody. Her father had sent her to Dodge City to finalize an arrangement with a dry goods supplier, a trip that should have taken 2 days out and 2 back. She had taken the wagon herself. Harold's hip was playing up badly, and the journey was too rough for him, with a company of other travelers heading the same direction, a loose group of 7 including a pair of homesteading families, an itinerant preacher, and a whiskey drummer named Horatio Cole who talked too much. They had set out on a clear, cold morning, and the first day had gone smoothly enough. The second morning they rose before dawn to make good time, and by mid-morning they were in open prairie land where the winter sky was enormous and pale, and the wind had a mean edge to it. James Ramsey was among the travelers in that group, which Edith had discovered the first morning with a private sense of mild irritation. He was riding alone on a dark bay horse, not part of either family's wagon, keeping to himself at the back of the loose procession as they moved. He nodded to her when they met at the fire that first morning and otherwise ignored her, which suited her fine. It was on the second day, around noon, that they came across the man. He was lying on the side of the trail, off the track in the scrub grass, and if it had not been for Horatio Cole's wagon drifting a little wide on a rut, they might have passed him without seeing him at all. Cole's wheel sent up a noise and Cole cursed and looked down and then shouted for everyone to stop. Edith climbed down from her wagon with the others. The man on the ground was perhaps 50 years old, with sunburned skin cracked and peeling around his lips and nose, and he was barely conscious. He had a horse somewhere behind him. They could see the hoofprints going back the way they had come, but the horse was gone now, wandered or bolted, and the man had been lying there for what looked like hours. Heat exhaustion, said the preacher who had some medical knowledge, and dehydration. This wind deceives you. A man does not feel how dry it is because the cold hides it. He looked up. We need water. Everyone reached for their own provisions immediately and then stopped. It was a very human moment, the instinct for self-preservation pausing the instinct for charity, because they all knew what the road ahead looked like. There was no water source for another 12 miles. The wind was strong and the air was dry and the journey was long, and every drop in their canteens was a drop they had measured against their own need. The homesteaders had families. The preacher's hands were already moving toward his canteen, but his face had the look of a man in genuine conflict. Horatio Cole had already taken 2 steps back toward his wagon. Edith had her own canteen in her hand. She had measured it that morning, half full, which was 2 decent drinks if she was careful, and she was 12 miles from the next water. She stood there in the wind with the canteen in her hand and her calculations running clearly in her mind, and she was not proud of the fact that she hesitated. James Ramsey did not hesitate. He swung down from his horse in one fluid motion and was kneeling beside the man before the dust from his landing had settled. He pulled his canteen from his saddle, and Edith saw clearly because she was close and watching and there was nothing to obstruct her view, that when he tilted the canteen to hear how much was in it, the sound was the small hollow sound of nearly empty. He had very little left, less than she had. He had been riding hard in that drying wind, and he had a long road still, and he had very little left in that canteen. He uncapped it anyway. He lifted the man's head with the practiced gentleness of someone who had handled injured creatures before, and he tipped the canteen carefully, patiently, letting the water run slowly enough for the man to swallow without choking. "Easy," James said quietly. "Easy now, small sips." The man swallowed. His eyes fluttered and focused with the small panicked urgency of someone returning from a long way off. "Small sips," James said again, and tilted the canteen again, and kept going until the man's color began to change, and his breathing slowed into something more regular. Edith watched the canteen, and she watched James Ramsey's face, and she watched his throat, because when he finally lifted the canteen away and shook it to confirm what she already knew, that it was empty, absolutely empty, not a swallow left, she watched to see if any expression of regret or resentment crossed his face. There was none. There was nothing on his face except the steady concentration of a man doing what needed doing, checking the stranger's pulse at his wrist, asking him in that flat, quiet voice if he could sit up, if he had any wounds apart from the sun and the dry. It was the homesteading family on the north side of the group, a woman named Mrs. Haverson, who then stepped forward without a word and handed her canteen to James, who passed it to the stranger. And then the preacher stepped forward with his. And Edith, feeling something shift in her chest like a heavy stone finding a new resting place, uncapped her own and stepped forward too. They got the man on his feet after a time. His name was Fletcher, he said. He was traveling to visit his daughter in Dodge City, and his horse had shied at something and thrown him and then run, and he had been lying there he did not know how long. He was shaky but walking. James loaded him onto the back of one of the homesteader's wagons, speaking to Mr. Haverson in a quiet way that Edith could not quite hear, and then he came back to his horse and remounted. Edith was standing at her own wagon. She did not plan what she said next. She said it because it came out of her before she had fully organized her thoughts. "You gave him everything you had." James looked at her from his saddle. The wind pushed at his hat brim and he held it down with one hand, and for a moment he just looked at her with those dark eyes, and she could not read the expression behind them clearly. "Didn't seem like the kind of situation that called for keeping count," he said. He rode forward to the head of the group before she could respond. She stood at her wagon a moment longer than necessary, and the stone in her chest had shifted again, and she thought, with the careful fairness she tried to apply to all things, that perhaps she had been working with incomplete information. The 12 miles to the next water source passed in the cold wind, and Edith drove her wagon and thought about the sound of that empty canteen, the small hollow rattle of nothing left, and the way he had tipped it anyway. They reached Dodge City the following morning, and Edith conducted her business with the supplier, a precise transaction that took most of the day and left her satisfied with the terms she had negotiated. She was good at negotiation, had learned it from her mother, who had run a household of 5 on a schoolteacher's salary, and had known the exact worth of every penny and every word. She saw James Ramsey once in Dodge City at a distance, coming out of a livery stable with a freshly watered horse. He had replaced his canteen, she noticed. She noticed because she looked for it. The return journey was uneventful except for a stone in the wagon wheel that had to be worked out on the second afternoon, and when she was crouched at the wheel working at it with a stick, James came by and stopped his horse and watched. "Need a hand?" he asked. She almost said no. She had the stone about halfway out. "I have it," she said, and then the stick slipped and the stone wedged itself more firmly and she made a sound of frustration. He swung down from his horse and came to crouch beside her without being invited, which should have annoyed her, and instead felt, in the inexplicable way some things do, like simple practicality. He did not take the stick from her. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a folding knife and used the thin tip of the blade to work the stone free from the other side, and between the two of them the stone came loose. He folded the knife away and stood, brushing the grit from his hands. "Thank you," she said. "Sure," he said, and went back to his horse. She watched him mount and ride forward again, and she thought, "This man is not what I decided he was." And the fair, honest part of her brain, the part that had kept her father's books with impeccable accuracy and would not fudge a number no matter how convenient it would be, that part of her brain said plainly, "You saw him push Cyrus Aldridge out of his way on a boardwalk, and you built a whole man out of that one moment. That is not accounting. That is not fair." She drove the rest of the way to Caldwell with that thought sitting uncomfortably in her mind, and she arrived home tired and cold, and with a revised opinion of James Ramsey that she had not sought and was not entirely sure what to do with. November gave way to December, and December brought a cold that settled into Caldwell like a permanent resident. The mercantile grew busy in the early weeks as people stocked up for winter, and Edith was grateful for the work, because it left her little time for anything so idle as thinking about a particular cowboy. James Ramsey remained in Caldwell through December, which was unusual, she gathered, though Walt Perkins explained that some of the cattle operations did business year-round, and that James had taken on some work with a local rancher named Emmett Grover, who ran a spread 6 miles south of town and needed hands through the winter months. He came into the mercantile twice in early December. Both times were straightforward transactions, Nothing remarkable, and he was as he had been before. Direct, quiet, not unfriendly but not warm. She noticed that he never once talked about himself unless asked, and when she asked once, carefully, how the road back from Dodge City had been after he had left their group, he said only that it had been fine and thanked her for asking. It was her father who created the situation that changed things, because Harold Barrett had a generous instinct toward everyone and a complete inability to see when his generosity was going to create difficulties for other people, which in this case meant his daughter. Harold invited James Ramsey to Christmas dinner. He had run into him on Main Street, as he explained to Edith that evening with the cheerful obliviousness of a man who saw no possible problem with what he had done. James had helped him carry a heavy crate up from the back of the supply wagon when Harold's hip had suddenly given out, and Harold, being Harold, had been moved to gratitude in the most expansive way possible. "He's eating alone at the boarding house on Christmas," Harold said, settling into his chair with his pipe. "No man ought to eat alone on Christmas, Eddie. He's a grown man who presumably prefers his own company," she said. "Nonsense. He said yes, so he cannot prefer it that much." She stood in the kitchen for a moment after that, listening to the fire and the wind outside, and she thought, well, all right then. Christmas dinner was the 25th of December, 1878, and Edith cooked a proper meal because she was not the kind of person who did anything halfway. There was a roasted chicken and bread she had made herself and dried apple pie and potatoes, all of it representing the best she could manage on what the Kansas winter and a mercantile owner's income allowed. She set the table properly, with the good dishes that had come from Wichita, and she put a candle in the center, and she told herself that this was for her father's sake and had nothing particularly to do with her own feelings on the matter. James arrived at 6 o'clock wearing a clean shirt, which she noticed, and his hair was damp at the edges as though he had recently made the acquaintance of a comb and water, which she also noticed and found quietly amusing. He brought a bottle of wine, dark red and not cheap, which surprised her. "You did not have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. Harold was delighted by both the wine and the man, and the conversation at dinner was easier than Edith had anticipated, because Harold could talk to anyone and drew people out with the unconscious ease of someone genuinely interested in other people. He asked James about the cattle drives, about the country south of Caldwell, about Missouri, and James answered with the careful honesty that was apparently his characteristic mode, not expansive but not withholding, saying what was true and leaving out what was not relevant. Edith mostly listened, because she preferred listening when she could learn things, and what she learned over the course of that dinner was this. James Ramsey had been 15 when the war ended, and the version of Missouri he came back to afterward was not the same one he had left. He did not say it with self-pity. He said it with the flat, factual tone of someone reporting weather conditions. He had gone west because the East held nothing for him, and the West held at least the possibility of something. He had been doing what he did for 15 years and was good at it and was not dissatisfied with it, but when Harold asked him, with the gentle curiosity of a man who truly wanted to know, if there was anything else he wanted, James looked at his wine glass for a moment before answering. "I think a man ought to have a place," he said. "Something of his own. I have not found the right place yet." Edith thought about that answer for a long time afterward. After dinner Harold retired early, as he often did, his hip-making sitting at a table uncomfortable past a certain hour, and Edith and James washed the dishes together in the kitchen, with the domesticity of it being slightly strange to both of them and neither mentioning it. The kitchen was warm from the stove and the wind was loud outside, and it was quiet between them in a way that was not uncomfortable, which she found interesting. "The wine was very good," she said. "Thank you." "My mother had a particular opinion about wine," he said. "She would have had something to say about Kansas as a place to drink it, but the wine itself would have met her standard." She looked at him. He was drying a plate and watching his own hands, and there was something in his expression that was not quite a smile but was in the general neighborhood of one. It changed his face considerably, that near smile, made him look younger than 30, and not at all like the man she had watched stride down the boardwalk with no regard for who was in his way. "You do not talk about your family often," she said, carefully. "No," he agreed. She waited in case there was more, and there was. "My mother was a good woman," he said. "Very stubborn, very precise about things that mattered to her and very flexible about things that did not. She kept accounts in this small blue book, and she knew to the penny what every household expense was, and she never let us go without knowing where we stood." He paused. "She would have liked your mercantile." Edith held a dish in her hands and looked at the wall and felt something warm and complicated move through her. "She passed?" she asked. "In 1871, he said. "The influenza. By then I was already west." "I am sorry." "So am I," he said, with a simplicity that was more affecting than any elaboration could have been. They finished the dishes, and she poured the last of the wine into 2 glasses, and they sat at the kitchen table because the sitting room had Harold in it, quietly dozing by the fire, and neither of them wanted to disturb him. The candle on the kitchen table was a small stub, but it burned steadily. "I owe you an apology," Edith said. He looked at her with that evaluating directness she had come to recognize as his natural mode. "For what?" "I formed a very firm opinion of you the first week I was in Caldwell," she said. "You pushed Cyrus Aldridge out of your way on the boardwalk, and I decided what kind of man you were on the basis of that one thing, and then I spent several months being confirmed in that opinion by my own determination to hold it." He was quiet for a moment. "Cyrus Aldridge gets in the way a fair amount," he said. "He does," she agreed. "But that is not the point." She looked at him directly because she believed in directness when it was needed. "I watched you give your last water to that man on the Dodge City Road. You did not hesitate, and you did not make anything of it afterward. I have been thinking about that since November, and I think I was not fair to you." He looked at her for a long moment. The candlelight moved over his face, and she could see that he was considering how to answer with the same care he apparently applied to everything. "I appreciate that," he said finally, "but I would tell you not to think too highly of me on the basis of one moment either. It seems like the same error in reverse." She looked at him with something that she recognized, with a small internal start, as admiration. "That is a very fair point," she said. "I make one occasionally," he said, and this time it was a smile, a real one, brief and slightly crooked, and it rearranged his face into something that Edith found, to her considerable surprise, quite arresting. The wine was gone, and the candle was low, and outside the wind had quieted, and she said good night to him at the door and watched him walk down the cold street toward the boarding house, his breath making small clouds in the air, and she stood in the doorway a moment longer than strictly necessary. She told herself it was because the cold air was bracing after the warmth of the kitchen. January in Caldwell was a serious business. The cold was not the romantic sort that features in paintings. It was a practical, grinding cold that found every gap in every wall and made the business of living feel like an ongoing negotiation with an unfriendly force. The mercantile stove worked hard, and Edith kept a pot of coffee on it through the whole of the working day, and people came in to buy things and also to stand near the warmth for a few minutes and talk to someone. James came in on the 2nd of January with a list of supplies for Emmett Grover's ranch, a proper itemized list written in a clear hand that Edith was surprised by, though she recognized immediately that she should stop being surprised by things that contradicted her original impression. She filled the order, and he loaded it into the ranch wagon and came back to settle the account, and she was aware, in a way that she had not precisely been before, of how much space he occupied when he stood at the counter, not invasively but solidly, like a piece of good furniture that had been built for where it stood. "Grover's lucky to have reliable help in the winter," she said, which was a more personal observation than she typically made with customers, and she knew it even as she made it. "It suits me to stay put for a while," he said. "Winter does not favor the road." She looked up from the account book. "Will you go back to the trail drives in spring?" He considered the question with the same seriousness he brought to everything. "That depends," he said. She waited. "On a few things," he finished, and she had the clear impression that he had been about to say something more specific and had thought better of it, and the impression gave her a small private warmth that she tucked away carefully. He paid and left, and she stood at the counter for a moment looking at nothing in particular and thinking about how the word depends, used in that way, in that voice, could carry so much without saying anything definite at all. February brought a hard freeze and then a thaw and then another freeze, and Edith's daily world was the mercantile and the meals and the accounts and her father's good company, and the rhythm of a life that was small by some measures but full by others. She had books, which she read in the evenings, and she had a correspondence with her friend Clara in Wichita, and she had the satisfaction of work done well, which was not nothing. She also had the increasingly frequent visits of James Ramsey, who seemed to find reasons to come into town from the Grover Ranch, with a regularity that even Walt Perkins eventually commented on. "That Ramsey boy has been in town more this winter than any winter I have seen him," Walt said one morning in a conversational tone that was barely pretending not to be pointed. "The Grover Ranch has extensive supply needs," Edith said. Walt made a sound that communicated a great deal. She did not dignify it with a response. James did not, in fact, always come into the mercantile. Sometimes he came and bought things and left. But other times, more times as January became February, he lingered, which for him meant he leaned against the counter and talked, which was still not much talking by most standards but was, she was learning, quite a lot of talking for him. He had an opinion about almost everything that he had seen or done, and when she drew it out of him, it came in that measured, plain-spoken way that she had come to realize she liked very much, because he never said anything he did not mean and never meant anything he did not say. She told him about Wichita one afternoon, about growing up there, about her mother who had died when Edith was 17, and had left her the best possible inheritance of practical competence and clear thinking, and James listened to all of it with his full attention, which was the kind of attention that made you feel that the thing you were saying was worth saying. "You are a great deal like her," he said, when she had described her mother teaching her to balance a household account. "I take that as the highest compliment," she said. "I mean it as one," he said simply. She looked at him. He looked back at her. The fire in the stove popped once and the wind moved outside and old Mrs. Calloway came in through the door before the moment could develop into anything more definite, wanting buttons, and the ordinary world reasserted itself. But Edith carried that look with her for the rest of the day, and she knew, with the same clear honesty she applied to accounting, what it meant. It was mid-February when James asked her to walk with him on a Sunday afternoon, which was the closest thing Caldwell had to a leisure day. He asked her in the mercantile on Saturday morning, carefully, directly, without embellishment, and she said yes in the same spirit, and her heart did something she told herself was merely a physiological response to the unexpected. The Sunday was cold but clear, the kind of winter day that is all pale light and hard ground and huge sky. They walked along the road south of town, and then off the road into the open land, and it occurred to Edith that she had not walked purely for the pleasure of walking in several months, and that it felt very good, and that the company was a significant part of why. James talked more on that walk than she had heard him talk at any one time, not about himself precisely, but about the land, which he clearly knew well and thought about in ways that surprised her. He told her how the grass would look in May, which he had seen enough times to describe in detail, and he pointed to where the creek ran under the ice and explained how it would sound in spring, and she listened and looked at what he pointed to and found that his way of seeing a landscape was like his way of seeing everything else, careful and specific and honest. "You love this country," she said, "even the hard parts of it." He thought about that. "I respect it," he said. A man who loves the West the way some men talk about loving, it tends to come to grief, because he is loving an idea. The actual land will kill you if you are not paying attention. But if you respect it, if you understand what it requires of you and you meet those requirements, then it will give you something back. A kind of freedom, maybe. Room to be what you are without anybody particularly noticing. She was quiet a moment. Is that what you want, to not be noticed? He glanced at her. I want to be known, he said carefully. That is different from being noticed. She thought about that for a moment and found it to be one of the most precise things she had ever heard anyone say. Yes, she said, it is very different. They walked back toward town in the low winter sun, and at some point, in a way that neither of them acknowledged or arranged, their gloved hands were side by side and then together, his hand covering hers, warm through the leather, and neither of them mentioned it and neither let go until they reached the edge of town where other people were, and even then the letting go was slow. She lay awake that night thinking about his hand, and about what he had said about wanting to be known, and about the look he had given her in the mercantile, and about a great many things that added up to a sum that was clear and could not be massaged into something different no matter how she tried, which she did not particularly try. She was falling in love with James Ramsey. She had begun falling sometime in November on the Dodge City Road, when she watched an empty canteen tip for a stranger, and the falling had been quiet and steady ever since. March came, and with it the first hints of spring in the grass and the longer light, and the world began to wake up from its winter stillness with the gradual determination of something large that had been sleeping. The cattle operations began to stir. Men who had spent the winter in boarding houses started talking about the trail and the South and the driving season, and Edith felt, beneath the general activity of spring in the mercantile, the specific anxiety of the question that had been building since January. Would James go back to the trail drives when spring came? He had said it depended on a few things. She thought she understood now what some of those things might be. But understanding and knowing were different, and she was not the sort of person who assumed. It was the last week of March when James came into the mercantile on a Tuesday morning, which was her slow morning, her inventory morning, and she wondered if he knew that, and he was not buying anything, which was immediately apparent because he had no list and no wagon outside, and he came in and stood at the counter and looked at her with an expression that was unusually, for him, quite readable. Emmett Grover has offered me a permanent position, he said, foreman of the ranch, full year, not just winters. She kept her expression careful and her voice steady. That is a significant offer. It is, he agreed. It means staying in one place. Caldwell, she said. Yes, he said. Caldwell. They looked at each other. James, she said. Edith, he said. They had not used each other's first names before, she realized. It felt different, realer. I would like to know what you think, he said, about whether Caldwell seems like a place a person might build something in, something lasting. She put the pencil she had been holding down on the counter very deliberately. I think, she said, choosing her words with care, that Caldwell is a town that is still deciding what it wants to be. And I think that the deciding is being done by the people who stay and do the work of deciding. And I think that a person who respects a place the way you respect a piece of land, and who understands what a place requires of you and meets those requirements, could build something very solid here. He was quiet for a moment. I would want to build it with somebody, he said. She felt something expand in her chest, large and warm. That seems wise, she said. He came around the counter then, which was the kind of presumption that 6 months ago she might have bristled at, and now felt instead like the most natural movement in the world, and he was standing quite close to her, and his dark eyes were very steady on hers. I think you know what I am trying to say, he said. I am not much for speeches. I know, she said. You do not need to make one. I am asking if you would be willing to get to know me better, he said, with the intention of something more permanent. It was the most measured, careful, honest declaration she had ever heard, and it was exactly right for who he was, and she loved it. I would be willing, she said, On the condition that you understand I have a very strong character and definite opinions, and I will not change either of those things." "I know," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved. "That is substantially part of the attraction." She laughed, and it was a genuine laugh, not the polite social kind, and his whole face changed at the sound of it, softened in a way she had not seen before, and she thought, "I want to make that happen again. I want to make that happen many times." He was not a man who kissed a woman he'd made no formal promise to, she discovered, which was something else to revise in her understanding of him, not moral cowardice but moral architecture, a sense of how things ought to be done. He took her hand instead, briefly, with the same warm solidity she remembered from the walk in February, and said he would call on her father that evening if she had no objection. She had no objection. Harold Barrett, when called upon that evening, was so poorly disguised in his delight that even James seemed slightly amused by it. Harold gave his blessing with the enthusiasm of a man who had been hoping for exactly this outcome, and had been tactful enough not to say so, and then he poured them all a glass of something he had been saving for an occasion. "To Caldwell," Harold said, raising his glass. "Which I confess I was not certain about when we came here, but which has turned out to have quite a lot to recommend it." Edith looked at James over the rim of her glass, and James looked back at her, and there was so much in that look that she felt it might take years to fully read, which seemed, rather than intimidating, like a very fine thing. The courtship, if that is the word for it, was conducted with the same honest directness that characterized both of them. They walked when the weather allowed and sat in the mercantile kitchen on evenings when it did not, talking the way she imagined the very best talking must be, with genuine curiosity and without performance, saying real things about real matters, and discovering with each conversation that the territory of the other person was larger and more interesting than the last conversation had revealed. She learned about the trail drives in detail, the scale of them, the particular challenges, the strange democracy of a cattle drive, where a man's worth was measured purely by his competence, and the color of his skin still created injustices that James spoke about with a quiet anger that she respected, because it was the anger of a man who had seen something wrong and named it plainly, and did not make peace with it simply because it was common. He told her about the black cowboys he had worked alongside, men of extraordinary skill, who received a third of the recognition, and were denied entry at tables where lesser riders sat comfortably. And he said it was a wrong that sat badly with him, and he had more than once said as much to men who had the power to do something about it, with limited results, but he had said it. She told him things she had told almost no one, about the particular loneliness of being a precise and intelligent woman in an era that frequently found those qualities inconvenient in a woman, about the years of keeping her own counsel, because her observations were not always welcome, about the quiet determination that had kept her going. He listened the way he listened to everything, with his whole attention, and he said once that the world had a great deal to answer for in what it required of women, and that he hoped she knew he did not intend to be part of that problem. "You had better mean that," she said. "I do," he said without flinching. She believed him, and she was right too. April became May, and Caldwell came into its spring colors, and James was formally installed as foreman at Emmett Grover's ranch, which meant he had regular hours and a regular wage, and something that resembled a future with edges on it. The question of marriage, which had been implicit since March, became explicit on a Saturday afternoon in early May when they were sitting on the fence at the edge of the Grover ranch looking at the spring grass, which was, as James had predicted, extraordinary green and waving and enormous under the Kansas sky. "I would like to marry you," he said. He said it the way he said everything important, without preamble, looking at the thing directly. "I know," she said. "Yes." He looked at her. "Yes," she said again, more clearly, with the full weight of what she meant in it. He took her hand and held it, and they sat on the fence rail in the spring afternoon for a long, quiet time, and it was one of the best moments of her life, she thought, The ones where the large, important thing has been said and settled, and there is nothing to do now but be in it. The wedding was in June, on a clear morning that started cool and warmed slowly to the kind of perfection that Kansas occasionally condescended to provide. It was a modest ceremony at the small church that had been built the previous year, officiated by the preacher who had been on the Dodge City Road in November, a coincidence that Edith found both apt and pleasing. Harold walked her up the aisle with his hip causing him enough trouble that they went slowly, and she was glad of the slowness, because it gave her time to look at James standing at the front of the church in a good dark coat that was clearly new and his hat that was clearly his best. And he was looking at her with an expression that she had never seen on his face before, and that she intended to see for the rest of her life. It was the look of a man who had been looking for a place and had found one. The whole of Caldwell came, or near enough. Walt Perkins came and cried, which he afterward attributed to dust. Mrs. Calloway came with a hat that was a monument to optimism. Emmett Grover came and shook James's hand, and said something in his ear that made James nod seriously. Horatio Cole, the whiskey drummer who had been on the Dodge Road too, sent a note because he was not in town, but he sent it, which Edith found touching. Even Cyrus Aldrich came, cleaned up and straight, and shook both their hands with genuine warmth, which Edith afterward mentioned to James as evidence that impressions built on single moments were unreliable. "They can be," James agreed. "As I told you," she said. "As you told me," he agreed, in the tone of a man who has lost an argument he does not particularly mind losing. They settled into the house that James had arranged, a proper house at the edge of Caldwell with 2 rooms and a kitchen, and a porch that looked south toward the Grover Ranch, and beyond it the open country. It was not large, but it was solid, built well, which James had ensured by participating in the construction himself, knowing what to check and what corners not to cut. He had an eye for structural integrity that applied equally to buildings and to everything else in his life, and Edith found it one of his most reliable and admirable qualities. The house needed furnishing, which she attended to with the combination of economy and taste that her mother had instilled in her, and James brought no objection to any choice she made, because he had told her truthfully that he had no strong opinions about furniture except that it ought to be sturdy, and she agreed with that requirement and applied it liberally. Life at the house fell into a shape that fit them both better than either had expected. James rose early, which she did too, and they drank coffee together in the kitchen in the early dark before he rode out to the ranch, and in the evenings he came home to supper, and they talked over the day. She continued to work at the mercantile, which had always been the plan and which James supported entirely, and Harold, whose health had begun to improve with the spring, was glad of the help. There were adjustments, as there always were. James was not naturally talkative in the evenings when he was tired, and Edith had to learn that his quiet was not withdrawal from her but simply recovery, and that the quality of the conversations they had was not diminished by the evenings when there were fewer words. He had to learn that her precision could on occasion tip into a stubbornness that was worth challenging, and he learned to challenge it without backing down, which she respected because she did not want a man who deferred to her in everything. She wanted a man she could argue with productively and arrive with at a better answer than either had started with. They were, in short, very well matched, in the particular way that does not come from similarity of temperament, but from complementarity of it, each providing what the other lacked and both finding in the other a quality they had not entirely known they were looking for. By the following spring, 1880, there was the matter of a child. Edith discovered it in February and told James on a quiet evening in the kitchen with the directness she brought to everything. He was very still for a moment, and then he reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and she could feel from the pressure of it what he could not quite find words for immediately. "Are you well?" he asked first, which she thought was exactly the right question. "I am very well," she said. He looked at her hand under his for a moment. "Good," he said, And then he looked up and there was that expression she had first seen at their wedding, the one she had promised herself she would see again many times, and she thought, yes, exactly that. She told her father the next morning, and Harold cried openly and without apology, which was Harold, and which she loved him for. The pregnancy suited her, which was something not all women could say honestly. She was not without discomfort in the early months, but she was healthy and strong, and the mercantile kept her occupied, and she found occupation one of the best remedies for anything. James was careful with her in ways that she allowed without making a fuss about, because there was a difference between being careful with someone and treating them as though they were fragile, and he understood that difference intuitively. The baby arrived in October of 1880, on a night that was cold and windy, but not as dramatically so as the night Edith had privately feared it might be, because Kansas weather tended toward the dramatic and she had prepared herself for something Shakespearean. It was, instead, a long and difficult but uncomplicated labor attended by Mrs. Patterson, the midwife, and Harold, who was sent to sit in the kitchen and was heard through the wall saying prayers in a low, continuous murmur. The baby was a boy. James held him in the kitchen afterward, where Mrs. Patterson had brought him wrapped in a flannel that Edith had made, and Edith watched from the bed where she was propped on 2 pillows, exhausted and more deeply happy than she had known happiness could be, as James stood in the kitchen holding this impossibly small creature with the same careful steadiness he brought to everything, and she thought, he will be a very good father. They named him William Harold Ramsey. Harold, who was told the next morning, had to sit down. William was a serious baby who became a serious and curious boy, with dark eyes like his father and a tendency toward quiet observation that also came from his father, but was undercut by his mother's precision and her capacity for asking the exact right question at the exact right time, so that what he observed he also articulated, in the careful, plain-spoken way of both parents. He was 3 years old in 1883 when Edith realized there would be another child, which she told James on the same quiet kitchen evening, same deliberate honesty. "Well," James said, and there was warmth in it and the corner of his mouth moved. "Well," she agreed. This child was a girl, born in August of 1883, and they named her Clara after Edith's friend in Wichita, who was so pleased she sent a gift all the way from Wichita, a small wooden box with a painted bird on it that Edith kept on the kitchen shelf for years. Clara was very different from William, energetic and loud where he was quiet, inclined toward investigation of everything physical where he preferred to sit and think, and the two of them together created a particular household music that Edith and James learned the rhythms of the way you learn any music that is constantly playing around you. The mercantile continued to do well. Caldwell continued to evolve in the direction of more civilization and less of the rougher sort of life it had hosted in its early years, and Edith tracked these changes with the interest of a woman who understood that a town was a kind of account book, entries and exits, gains and losses, the balance always shifting. She and Harold were known as fair and honest dealers, which was the reputation she had wanted from the beginning, and the mercantile was a stable and respected establishment by the mid-1880s. James, at the Grover Ranch, had built a reputation of his own, a foreman who got results and treated his men with fairness, who did not cut corners on safety, and who maintained Emmett Grover's stock with a competence that had substantially increased the value of the operation. Emmett Grover was not a demonstrative man, but he expressed his appreciation in the ways that mattered, in fair wages and in trust. And James operated the ranch with the kind of authority that came from proven competence rather than from assertion. It was in 1884 that Emmett Grover's health began to fail, which was a concern for many reasons, including the fact that Emmett had no children and no clear successor to the ranch. He had a nephew in St. Louis who had shown no interest in ranching, and whose name Emmett mentioned with the practiced disappointment of a man who had long made his peace with the limitations of the available heirs. Edith and James discussed it one evening in the kitchen, William asleep in his room, Clara barely two and asleep in hers, with the candid thoroughness they brought to everything that mattered. "He has said he would consider selling," James said, "if the right offer came." She looked at him. "And would we have the right offer? Between what I have saved and what I know we could borrow against the mercantile," he said carefully, "we might come close." She thought about it, not for very long, because the bones of it were clear quickly and she was good at seeing bones. "The land is valuable," she said, "and you know it as well as anyone. You have been running it." "Yes," he said, "and you know what improvements it needs and what they would cost." "Yes," he said. "Then what is the hesitation?" He looked at her with an expression that was, for him, almost diffident. "It would mean risking the stability we have," he said. She understood that this was not a small thing to him, because stability was something he had built from very little and had not had in the formative years of his life, and he did not take it for granted the way people who had always had it sometimes did. "James," she said, "you told me once that you wanted a place, something of your own." He was quiet. "That ranch," she said, "is a place. And you have been running it for 6 years, and you know every inch of it, and every cow on it, and every hand who works it. It is not a gamble the way the word is usually meant. It is a calculated risk taken by a man who has already done the work to make it a good risk." He looked at her for a long time. "You are very persuasive," he said. "I am very accurate," she said. "There is a difference." He made an offer to Emmett Grover the following month, and Emmett accepted it, and the paperwork was done over the course of several weeks with the assistance of the lawyer in town. And in the spring of 1885, James Ramsey became the owner of a working cattle ranch 6 miles south of Caldwell, Kansas. He rode out to it, the morning the deed was signed, alone, on the dark bay horse's younger successor. A roan he had trained himself. And Edith stood at the window of the mercantile and watched him go down the street, and she felt, on his behalf, the particular joy of a thing long wanted finally secured. He came back that evening with trail dust on his coat and a quietness that was different from his ordinary quietness, fuller, and when she asked him how it felt, he stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her for a moment before he answered. "It feels like the first time in a long time," he said, "that I am exactly where I am supposed to be." She crossed the kitchen and put her arms around him, which she had done 1,000 times in 6 years of marriage, but which still felt, as the best things do, like the exactly right thing to do. Harold's health declined in 1886, which was slow and not unkind, as such things went. His hip had been bad for years, and his heart had begun to show its age. And by the summer he was spending more time in his chair than out of it, and Edith managed the mercantile with less and less of his help, and more of his cheerful commentary from the back room. He was, she thought, one of the happiest people she had ever known, not because his life had been easy, which it had not, but because he was constitutionally inclined toward gratitude, toward seeing what was there rather than what was missing, toward taking pleasure in small things which were in fact large things, like a granddaughter who climbed into his lap and a grandson who sat at his feet and listened to stories. He passed in October of 1886, on a quiet evening when the last of the summer warmth had gone, and the first real cold of autumn was in the air. Edith was with him and James was with him, and William, who was 6 and old enough to know what was happening, sat in the doorway with the wide grave eyes of a child witnessing an important thing. Harold went the way he had lived without particular drama, with a kind word, his hand in Edith's. She grieved him deeply and without shame, because he had been a good father and a good man, and the world was smaller without him. James was steady for her through it, in the way she had come to know he would be, not intrusive in his comfort but present, always present, a solid, warm point of constancy that she could orient herself by. They kept the mercantile, hiring a manager, a young woman named Agnes who had come to Caldwell the previous year and proved extremely capable, and Edith moved her involvement into the oversight role, keeping the accounts and making the larger decisions from the ranch, which was where her family was. The ranch grew in the years that followed. James had a careful, long-term approach to it that served him well, not expanding faster than was manageable, reinvesting steadily, maintaining good relationships with the cattle buyers in Wichita and Dodge City with whom he dealt fairly, and who therefore dealt fairly back. He hired men he trusted, paid them honestly, and by the early 1890s, the Ramsey Ranch was one of the better-regarded operations in the county, not the largest but reliably productive and well-run. William, at 12 in 1892, was already showing a strong interest in the land and the cattle, spending his free hours at his father's side with the quiet, focused attention that was entirely his father's, but served by the quick, precise questions that were entirely his mother's. James taught him everything with patience and thoroughness, the way he did all things, and Edith watched the two of them on the porch on summer evenings going over whatever question William had brought to dinner, and she thought, "This is what was meant. This is the thing that was being built." Clara, at 9, showed no particular interest in cattle but an enormous interest in everything else, and was attending school with the fierce concentration of someone who understood that learning was a form of freedom, which she had heard her mother say more than once, and apparently taken entirely to heart. It was in the summer of 1893 that Clara came running across the yard with a letter from Wichita, from Edith's friend of the same name, and the letter mentioned that Clara herself, the friend, was finally coming to visit, which she had been promising since the wedding and which Edith had long since ceased to expect but was thrilled to receive. Clara Whitfield arrived in August, smaller than Edith remembered and more gray-haired, but exactly the same in the essential ways, smart and warm, and inclined to say exactly what she thought, which had been the basis of their friendship since girlhood. She stayed 2 weeks and turned the ranch upside down in the most pleasant way possible, enchanting both children and becoming, by the end of the first week, James's unexpected ally in a running argument with Edith about whether the kitchen needed a larger window. It did need a larger window, both Clara and James agreed. "You are ganging up on me," Edith said. "We are being accurate," James said with a straight face. "That is my word," she said. "It was the right word," he said. "She got the larger window because they were right, and the extra light in the kitchen made it unquestionably better, and she told James this fairly when the work was done because fairness was something she practiced in all directions." "You could have just agreed," he said. "I could have," she said, "but then you would have missed watching me eventually admit you were right, which is rarer and therefore more valuable." He laughed fully, one of those real laughs that she had been collecting for 15 years. The 1890s brought Kansas through its own changes, droughts that tested every farmer and rancher in the state, population shifts, as some families who had tried the plains gave up and moved on, the ongoing political turbulence of a country that was arguing with itself about money and labor, and the rights of the people who did the actual work of the land. James had opinions about all of it and expressed them to Edith, and she had opinions of her own, and they argued and agreed and revised and arrived, and she thought the conversations of a good marriage were their own kind of democracy. The drought years of the early 1890s were hard. They were careful through it, James managing the cattle numbers with the discipline of a man who understood that the land's capacity was not infinite, and that the worst thing you could do in a dry year was pretend it wasn't dry. They tightened expenditures without panic, trusted the accounts Edith kept with her usual precision, and came through the difficult years intact, which was more than some of their neighbors could say. Through those years, they helped where they could, sharing water from the deeper of the ranch's wells when the creek ran low, trading feed with neighbors who were short, offering credit at the mercantile in ways that Agnes had standing instructions about, and that Edith reviewed with the same careful eye her father had never quite managed to apply. They did not do this with announcement or expectation of recognition. They did it because both of them had been formed by experiences that made them understand, in the specific way that knowledge earned by living is different from knowledge merely acquired, that the difference between getting through a hard time and not getting through one was sometimes as simple as whether someone else had a bit left over to give. William, by the time the drought broke in the mid-1890s, was 15 and working the ranch alongside James in a serious way. He had his father's physical capability and something more, a gift for reading weather and land that James said was better than his own had been at the same age. And James said this without any complicated feelings about it, only with the straightforward pride of a man who has raised something well. Clara, 13 by 1896, had announced with her characteristic decisiveness that she intended to be a schoolteacher, and had written to the county school board to inquire about what was required. Edith had helped her compose the letter and felt something expand in her chest at the sight of Clara's handwriting on official correspondence. The same directness, the same precise diction. James had read the letter over Clara's shoulder and nodded once. "Good letter," he said. "Mother helped," Clara said. "I see both of you in it," James said, and this satisfied both of them. In 1897, James turned 49 and Edith turned 43, and the ranch was prospering and the mercantile was under Agnes's reliable management. And William was 17 and nearly a man, and Clara was 14 and entirely herself. And one evening in late September they sat on the porch as they had done 10,000 times, the prairie stretched out before them going golden in the autumn light. And James put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into the solid warmth of him that she knew now the way she knew her own breathing. "Do you remember what you said to me," he said, "about Caldwell being a place where things were being decided by the people who stayed?" "I do," she said. "I think you were right," he said, "in all the ways you meant it." She looked at the land, the ranch, the grass, the enormous sky that had never stopped being enormous. "I think we decided some things," she said. "I think we did," he said. They sat in the quiet of the September evening, and the light moved on the grass the way it did when the year was turning, gold and amber and long. And somewhere behind them in the house, Clara was practicing the letters she would need for her school application, and William's boots could be heard on the kitchen floor getting supper from the stove. And the whole of what they had built was around them and in them. She thought about a boardwalk in Caldwell in the summer of 1878, a man she had dismissed in a moment, a judgment she had been wrong about in almost every particular. She thought about a trail south of Caldwell in November of that same year, a man on the ground, an empty canteen, and the absence of hesitation. She thought about how wrong she had been and how glad she was that being wrong had led her here. "James," she said. He said, without opening his eyes, his arms still around her. "I am very glad you shoved Cyrus Aldridge out of the way that day." He opened one eye and looked at her with an expression of complete bewilderment. "Beg pardon." "If you had not," she said, "I would not have been watching the boardwalk. I would have missed you entirely." He thought about this for a moment. "I am not sure that logic entirely holds up," he said. "It holds up perfectly," she said. "You should apologize to Cyrus the next time you see him. For getting you to marry me, for the occasion of our meeting." He looked at her for a long time with the look that she had been collecting since their wedding day, the one that said, "Here is the place." "Edith," he said. "Yes, I love you," he said plainly. In the way he said things he meant completely. She turned into his arm and put her hand on his chest and felt his heart beating steady under her palm. "I know," she said. "I love you too." The sun went the rest of the way down in the west, the way it did every evening in that great open country, and the stars began their slow appearance over the Kansas plain, and the two of them sat on the porch of the house they had built and said nothing else for a while because nothing else was needed. William came to the door and said supper was on and they ought to come in before Clara ate all of it, which was a real concern because Clara's appetite was legendary in the household. And Edith laughed and stood and gave James her hand, which he took and held as he stood. And they went in together to the warm lit kitchen, where their children were bickering companionably over the bread. and the stew was on the table, and the candle was burning, and all of it was exactly what it was meant to be. 3 years later, in 1900, William married a girl named Eleanor Cross from a farming family east of town, a sensible, warm woman who could ride a horse and keep accounts, and who had, Edith noted with quiet satisfaction, a strong character and definite opinions of her own. The wedding was at the ranch in June, under a sky that delivered on its promise for once, and Edith and James stood side by side and watched their son marry well, and James's hand found hers without either of them directing it. William and Eleanor built a small house on the east corner of the Ramsey Ranch land, close enough for practicality, far enough for dignity, and in 1901 they had a son, James's first grandchild, Harold William Ramsey, named for his great-grandfather first and his grandfather second, which made the naming order clear enough that James did not comment on it except to say he found it entirely correct. Edith held her grandson in the kitchen of William's house on the October afternoon he was born and thought about the weight of a child in arms, and how it was always the same weight regardless of how many times it happened, meaning everything. Clara became a schoolteacher in 1902, exactly as she had declared she would, and took a position in Caldwell itself, which meant she was close enough to come to Sunday dinner with enough regularity that the table felt right. She was 22 and entirely herself, and very good at teaching, her pupils apparently somewhat awed by her combination of genuine warmth and absolute refusal to accept less than their best work. She met a young man named David Pierce in 1903, a surveyor's assistant who had come through Caldwell on a land measurement project, and stayed because the work extended, and then, Edith suspected, because of Clara. He was quiet and precise and had a very dry sense of humor, and he and Clara argued about everything in the cheerful, combative way of two people who are evenly matched and deeply interested in each other, which Edith recognized immediately and approved of entirely. She told James about it one evening. "Surveyor," James said. "Assistant surveyor," Edith said. "Good prospects." "Quiet man," James said. He had met David Pierce twice. "He is not as quiet as you were," Edith said. James considered this. "That is not a high bar," he conceded. David Pierce asked James's permission before he proposed, which was the tradition of the time, and which James gave after a conversation that David said afterward was the most thorough interview he had ever conducted, which James took as a compliment to the seriousness with which he regarded his daughter. Clara said yes, which had never been in question to anyone who knew her, and they married in the spring of 1904 in the same church where James and Edith had married in 1878, now 26 years old and somewhat sturdier than it had been but still standing, which Edith thought was a fine metaphor for most things worth having. The years moved the way years do when you are living them forward rather than looking back at them, not slowly or quickly, but at the pace of the work and the seasons and the particular days that matter more than others and the long stretches of ordinary days that are the actual substance of a life and are not ordinary at all. James and Edith marked their 25th wedding anniversary in June of 1903 with a dinner at the ranch that their children organized, and that surprised Edith because she had not known it was planned, which was a considerable achievement given her tendency to know what was happening around her. The whole of the family came, William and Eleanor and young Harold, Clara, who was not yet married but brought David, Agnes from the mercantile, Walt Perkins, who was elderly now and somewhat smaller than she remembered him but still sharp and still talking. And it was, she thought, everything you could want a party to be. The right people in the right place with food on the table and the summer evening coming in through the wide kitchen windows. James made a toast, which surprised everyone including Edith, because he was not generally given to speeches. He stood with his glass and looked at the table full of people and then at her, and he said, "I spent a good part of my life certain that settling in one place was a kind of loss. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about several things I was certain of, and I was set right gently and not always without argument by this woman. He looked at her steadily. She is the best part of everything I have built, and I am grateful for every year. He sat down without further elaboration, which was him completely, and Edith had to attend carefully to the business of not crying, which she managed just barely. That was very good, she told him quietly later when the guests were gone and the house was quiet. I meant every word, he said. I know you did, she said. That is why it was very good. By 1905, Edith was 51 and James was 57, and young Harold was 4 and beginning to say things that were both exactly what you expected and entirely surprising, as 4-year-olds do, and Clara and David were expecting their first child in the autumn, and the ranch was doing well, and Agnes was still running the mercantile with the precision Edith had hired her for 2 decades ago. It was a Tuesday morning, Edith's old inventory morning of habit, when she sat at the kitchen table and opened her account book and looked at the numbers that told the story of what they had built, all the columns and sums and balances that added up to something clear and true, and she thought about a blue account book that James's mother had kept, small and precise, and thought that the woman had been right about what such things were for, not just tracking money but tracking the shape of a life. What comes in and what goes out and what remains. What remained was substantial. She wrote in the margin of the page, which was not a place for words but was hers to use as she liked, 27 years. A ranch, a mercantile, 2 children, 2 grandchildren, a life built board by board. Then she thought about a boardwalk in 1878 and a first wrong impression and a road to Dodge City in November and a canteen tipped empty for a stranger. And she wrote one more line, began with correct information. James came in from the early morning at 7:30 and poured his coffee and sat across from her at the table and looked at what she was writing with the patient curiosity of a man who had learned that her writing in the margins of account books generally signified something worth knowing. Working out the figures, he said. Yes, she said, all the figures. He looked at her with those dark eyes that were the same eyes they had always been, steady and honest and exact. How do they look, he said. She looked at him, at the face she had been reading for 27 years and was still finding new things in, at the lines around his eyes that were hers in a sense, earned in her company, and she felt the warmth of it move through her the way warmth does when you have been sitting near a good fire long enough that you forget you are near it and notice only when you move away. They look exactly right, she said. He picked up his coffee and looked out the window at the September morning, the grass and the sky. The country they had made their own by staying in it and working it and being in it fully, and he said nothing because it did not need saying, and she turned back to her account book and wrote the next line. And outside the window the world went on in all its difficult and beautiful and utterly specific particularity, and the Ramsey house was warm, and the fire was steady. And it was exactly where it was supposed to be.